That was a nice intro. I didn't know David was going to introduce me, and I was going to plug the intro workshop for the beginners who have been coming up to me with a little bit of confusion. That's kind of how workshops will go once in a while because it's a lot of information and in a very condensed period of time. So I recommend this. And if you have not read Pluto Volume 1, new people, this is kind of like the EA Bible. And there are several of us who have copies that are very tattered and torn and highlighted and marked and glued and everything. So we highly recommend this for beginners who need some help through all of the information that's coming at you right now. So thank you very much. The title of both of my lectures is Letting Go and Second Chances, or Planetary Retrogrades. So I happen to be a pretty spontaneous speaker, and I also am one who likes to ask questions to you to figure out where my audience is at so that I can work to address you. So what I'm going to do with these two lectures is, first of all, today we're going to work with Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. I'm not having any chart examples because I figure these are common retrogrades. You guys will have them in your own charts. I'm going to ask you to reflect on your own charts as I bring out the archetypes for this. Tomorrow's lecture will be Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and I happen to have a chart example of 5 planetary retrogrades for tomorrow, one chart. So we will work with chart examples when we get into tomorrow's material. So to start right off, I'm going to ask one of these reverse psychology questions. Who in this room has no planetary retrogrades? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm number 6. Not the nodes. We're not going to talk about the nodes. We're just going to do planetary archetypes to simplify understanding. So because I have no planets retrograde, I'm not qualified to do this talk. Who wants to take my place? What we're going to do is go through each of these planetary retrogrades, and as we do each one, we're going to find out who of you has that particular planet retrograde. So as a group, we get an idea of just how these planetary retrogrades work collectively for us. So let's start out with what is retrograde. What is a planetary retrograde? We all know we live here on Earth, which is what we know as a geocentric viewpoint. However, we have come a little ways past the 1600s and earlier when they insisted that we couldn't look at things from any other viewpoint except geocentric. We know that we really live in a heliocentric universe, which means the sun at the center with all of the planets going around it. Well, from our viewpoint here on Earth, the planets Mercury through Pluto will have an appearance out there when we watch them of actually going around in the sky and slowing down and stopping, and then appearing to go backwards or retrograde for a while, and then they stop and they go forward again. That is the appearance of retrograde. And so what happens is we make an S or a zigzag in the sky. So when we talk about this retrograde, we're going to go back over a certain area of the zodiac, and then we're going to go forward again. So there's 3 passages. So one of the things that we hear Jeffrey say with retrogrades is add a R-E to everything. Re-evaluate, redo, re-experience. Everything that you can think of that you can add that re-word in front of will probably fall into that retrograde category. Now, I'm an 8th house Pluto, and it's in Virgo, and so I have a tendency to not only want to understand things on the intuitive level or right brain, I also want to understand things on a left brain level. I like to get it both ways. So I'm just very briefly going to give you a visual on how the retrogrades actually look from the point of view of astronomy, and then we'll go from there. Go ahead.
Just going to tell you, actually, I have an animated graph which animates the whole process.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Works for me. Everybody should have the 2 handouts in their book, in their booklets anyway. Yeah, so everybody should have those. So hey, thank you again, Starman. So we'll let him do that. While he's doing that, I'll continue going forward with this, all right? So what we're going to do, to just get some basics for you before we go on to some specifics of the planets, is that when we look at these planetary retrogrades, some of us are born with planets retrograde in our chart natally, and that means we have that planet retrograde throughout an entire lifetime. It is a very individuated process when we have it that way. We also have the planetary retrogrades that keep happening in the sky. Mercury retrograde right now that we're going through. We have Jupiter retrograde, Pluto retrograde right now. When those happen on a collective level, we go through a review, re-evaluation. We have to do something over. We have to learn something in order to grow and evolve. So the retrogrades themselves will represent the process of evolution. And the retrograde will kind of be like a jump start or a energy that's pushing us to evolve. So when we have planetary retrogrades in our chart, what it can represent is areas where we have been in resistance in past lives. And so that planetary retrograde in your natal chart will show you where that resistance has been and where you have opportunities to actually accelerate some evolutionary growth in this particular lifetime. Greg, you have to tell me when you got it. Okay, go ahead.
Watch the date in the top left corner. This is over days, and there's the sun, and that's Mercury right in the center. The days are changing. Here it goes. There's your Mercury. Yeah, we need some music for that.
Okay, that's how Mercury and Venus work. Do you have the outer?
That's the one I have set up right now. I just have that one to show people.
Okay.
It's the same thing with all of them. Like, it looks the same sort of process. Forward and backward. And those are the dates changing in the top left corner there. So, all right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. We can let that go. So you got some idea of the visual, so you can see from our point of view on Earth, if you aren't dizzy yet, that is, that we have this process that looks like this zag from us, this S that it makes in the sky, all right? So a couple more generic points for you in regards to retrogrades. Whenever we have what we call stationary retrograde, that point where the planet appears to be stopping before it goes retrograde, or stationary direct, when it's just finishing up the retrograde cycle and appearing to go forward again, you actually have to look in your ephemerises to figure out whether you were born close to a stationary retrograde or a stationary direct. Those are very potent time periods. That energy is intensified even more. And so we'll work through the individual planets and how long they each are stationary retrograde, stationary direct. But that stationary retrograde, if you're born during that time period, either just before it goes retrograde or just after it goes retrograde, can you realize the intensity of resistance that you have had to that planetary archetype to be born during that time period? Same thing down here where it's turning stationary direct, or it's just getting ready to go direct, or just after it goes direct when it's known as being still in the sky, but it's just getting ready to go direct. It's a potent time period, but can you just, on an archetypical level, understand the ahas that you'll get from that? Because you're born right after this retrograde process is ending. So it means that you've been in some resistance, but you're just getting ready to really get it and go forward. So again, the stationary retrograde, stationary directs, you really need to look in the ephemeris to see exactly when they are happening. Now, anytime we have these planetary retrogrades, Mercury and Venus are known as the inferior planets because they are inside the Earth's orbit around the sun. Mars on out, they're known as the superior planets because they're outside the Earth's orbit. But any of the planetary retrogrades, when they make their interaction with the sun, that's the highlight of their retrograde cycle, it's also the time period that they're closest to Earth. So just on a vibrational level, being closer to us when there's a retrograde, it also intensifies our energy, our vibration, our synchronicity with having to go within and learn what is being represented by these planetary archetypes. By the way, anytime anybody has questions, you're welcome to interrupt me and ask. I don't mind, okay? All right, get that clear for you? So I want to check my notes again. I'm having to change hats, so until my speaking hat really gets flowing, I want to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything for you guys, all right? We consider someone to have a retrograde personality when they have like 4 or more planets that are retrograde. Again, tomorrow's chart, we're going to work with somebody who has 5 planets retrograde. So we'll get some real examples from that. But just looking at your own charts, 4 or more, you start to get into that. Those of you who have 3 planets retrograde could disagree. You could already think you have the retrograde personality, but that's kind of more or less what we go by. Also, if you have a planet that's retrograde and you have another planet that's opposing it, that's a non-retrograde planet, it can have a retrograde effect on the non-retrograde planet that's in opposition. It can sometimes even have an effect if it is a very tight aspect that we would know as the squares to the retrograde planet. The retrograde planet is always going to be the strongest in the archetype, but it can have some effect on the other non-retrograde planets that it interacts with. And again, the tighter the orb of the aspect, then the more it would tend to bring on that retrograde effect. Everybody with me so far? Yes?
Apply to the trines also.
It can apply to the trines and the sextiles and what we would know as the easier aspects if the orb was very, very tight. You know, by that point, you'd have to be getting to within like a degree or 2. You can use wider orbs with the harsher aspects to use those 2 words. So we've all learned that everything about life is a process of evolution. It never stops. And again, what the retrogrades are trying to help us do, or give us the potential to do, is to really accelerate our process and our abilities to evolve. So one of the things that I really like to work with people with in regards to evolutionary astrology is that everything's always in this process of evolution. So there is no such thing as a bad retrograde. Just like there's no such thing as bad aspects. As you have watched Kristen and others work with this cycle of aspects and phases, everything is always in a process of becoming to everything else. And so the more that you can eliminate this good, bad from your vocabulary, you know, the easier you will make it on yourself. I have Saturn, or I have a Capricorn rising, so Saturn ruling my chart. You know, I like Saturn. So again, the point of this is, take the judgments out of it. You know, Pluto and Virgo's talking here. Take the judgments out of it and allow yourself to embrace that retrograde and go, I'm free. I get to throw things off. I get a chance to really jump forward if I learn that energy to work with it. All right? So, as we move into Mercury and work with the Mercury retrograde, I want to use myself as an example a little bit, all right? But before we do that, how many of us in the room have Mercury retrograde? You all showed up for this conference because Mercury was retrograde, didn't you? The rest of us had trouble getting here, but you guys just flew right in. You didn't get any luggage lost. Your connections all happened really nice and smooth. There's another similar thing that I just want to speak of in regards to Mercury. And again, I'll share this through my own chart just because I've been watching Mercury retrogrades for over 20 years. And so I have found this to be something that's real true for myself. So it's a little bit of relief for some of you who don't have Mercury retrograde, that maybe still have a little bit of intensities through it. But first of all, let me back up and start at the beginning. Mercury, the planet of communications, the planet of what we know as the left brain versus right brain, Jupiter, the conscious mind versus the individuated unconsciousness, Uranus. Mercury is how we want to do that classification of everything, how we want to take that world that exists out there and says that this is a podium, that's a table, this is the dress, this is, it's how we are able to calm ourselves down, believe it or not, Mercury, and actually be able to go, okay, this is this, and this is this, and this is this, and so I can be okay because I've got everything figured out, and as I formulate all of these objects and what they are, it allows me to carry that forward, to go on, take in some more information, figure out these objects, and go on and go on. Well, sooner or later, we get overloaded. We have too much information going on in here, and we come in with a Mercury retrograde. And so what Mercury retrograde means is that you have spent past lives. Again, I'm going to talk probably more on an archetypical level of having it natally, but I want all of you to hear this on a collective level via transits and via progressions. I wasn't born with any retrograde planets, but I have Uranus and Pluto both retrograde by progression in my chart for the rest of my life. So I've kind of joined you guys in a way. Okay, so you understand how I'm talking about this. So we get an overload of information in the left brain, and it's like, we can't handle this anymore. And so we come in with this Mercury retrograde, and what we are trying to do is throw off all of the excess information, all of the excess thought. One of the most common things that we will hear about Mercury retrogrades is that you can't teach the children who have Mercury retrograde the same way you teach the non-Mercury retrograde children. Their brains don't wire the same way. They just don't want to learn information the same way. And think about it. If you've become overloaded with information and you come in with Mercury retrograde, you're only going to focus on what's relevant to you. There is Mercury retrograde. Planetary retrogrades will go to the opposite planet for information. Whenever you have a retrograde, whatever house it's in, the opposite house, the opposite sign will start to give you clues and answers. It like throws you over to the opposite side of the zodiac to get that polarity, to get that balance and that understanding. All right, following this? All right, so Mercury retrograde is about throwing off all of this information we're out there getting. It's kind of like pulling us in. All the retrogrades pull us within. All the retrogrades work to help us understand our own inner knowledge, our own inner planetary archetypes. But that Mercury retrograde is especially so. So when you look at a Mercury retrograde person, they'll have these cycles of animation, cycles of withdrawal. They'll have those cycles where, my gosh, they can't tell you enough facts about this area that is personally relevant to them. If it's something that they don't care about, you could talk to your blue in the face and they just won't hear you. And so, again, there's no right or wrong. It just means that there's been this excess of information and we're needing to throw it off, and we're needing to kind of like a fine tune, a fine focus to what's relevant. So a Mercury retrograde will not learn information until it is relevant. When it is meaningful to them, that's when they'll hear it. So all of you who have Mercury retrograde natally, when it's retrograde, well, like right now, you're the ones who are getting everything we're talking about right now this weekend. It's flowing. It's like coming in. The rest of us who are non-Mercury retrogrades, what'd they say? I didn't hear that. You guys buy the tapes, okay? Listen to it when Mercury's direct and you'll get it. But do you get my point?
Is it backwards? If it was Mercury direct right now, would I be having problems understanding what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. If I'm transposing, catch me. Yeah, see? But here's my relevancy, okay? I have Sun conjunct Mercury a half a degree, 29 minutes. That's known as combust. When any planet is less than half a degree from the Sun, it's known as being combust. And Mercury's not retrograde, it's direct. It means that when I was born, the Sun was in the middle and the Earth was here, and rather than Mercury being retrograde right here making the conjunction, here was Earth, here's Sun, here was Mercury over here. It's known as a superior conjunction when you have Sun conjunct Mercury direct. Well, when it's combust like that, for me, Mercury retrogrades, God has helped me. All that I know, and Mercury goes retrograde, and I am just like, my sweetie pie is just having to learn to be okay with me being when Mercury's retrograde. It just, the synapses don't work. You know, everything just gets disconnected. So those of you who have Mercury really close to the sun, and yet it is direct, so we're starting to get those conjunctions, 5 degrees either side, 4, 3, 2, 1, get down to less than a degree, you will have the same effects when Mercury goes retrograde. It'll have that same type of response within you. Okay? Everybody getting what I'm talking about? Making sense? Questions?
Could you say a little bit more about the polarity point with the retrograde planet?
The polarity point with the retrograde planet, meaning we have a planet and when it goes retrograde, it's pointing to the polarity. All right? Yeah. Excuse me.
I just mean, so how do you work with that in the chart?
All right, let's use an example, okay? Let's take Mercury where it is right now. It's in Aries, all right? We know that Aries is very spontaneous thought. When you put Mercury in Aries, very spontaneous thought, impulsively speaking, impulsively just wanting to let it all out. You know, the people who say something and then they realize what they've said. When Mercury is retrograde in Aries, it's pointing over there towards Libra. It allows you more energy to actually consider what you're going to say before you say it. Or it allows you still might spontaneously say it, but the moment you said it, I'm realizing what I said and how that person feels about it. Help? Example? You can also use it just in a generic point of view. Mercury naturally is 3rd house Gemini. Retrograde points to Jupiter 9th house Sag. Okay? Mercury also rules Virgo 6th house. Retrograde points to Neptune Pisces 12th. Can you see how we have to go from deductive logic to inductive logic? See how we have to start opening up to the intuition when we have Mercury retrograde. So think about it, when we have an excess of information in here and there's an involution, we have to go within, all right? Mercury retrograde is pointing towards the intuition. It's pointing to learning how to understand something on an intuitive level versus analyzing it to pieces. There was another question? Yes?
Did you say you have Mercury, the Sun, and the North Node conjunct?
No, I have Sun, Mercury, Neptune within 1 degree, 1 to 2 degrees Scorpio. So I usually tell my students, when I say the wrong planet, and I did, will you point it out to me? Would you let Neptune know?
A question about combust. You said, is it when any planet is less than 1 degree from the sun, it's called combust?
Yes.
Could you give a quick definition of that or what that means?
Combust, it means the energy is so fused together, you can't really separate it. All right? Yes. Yes. For me, with Sun conjunct Mercury 1/2 degree, I am one of those people where my mind never stops. Add in Neptune. And if Mercury wasn't retrograde, I take care of all those little details. What happens for me with Sun conjunct Mercury, I have to add in Neptune. It's almost impossible for me to separate Neptune because it's right there, 1 degree combust with it. I have this vivid imagination that can go all over the place. And so I have to then bring it down into space-time reality because I can't create everything that I can imagine. I have to prioritize what I'm going to actually create through this imagination that just doesn't quit.
That's why you like Saturn.
Yeah, Saturn. I need Saturn. Other questions? Yes.
What if Mercury is combust and retrograde?
Wow.
Even
What if
worse.
Mercury is retrograde and combust or conjunct the sun? That's the highlight of the retrograde cycle. The inferior planets, Mercury and Venus, when they are conjunct the sun, retrograde, that's the aha of the retrograde cycle. It's almost like think of it like a full moon phase. It's like, oh, I get it. It's whenever we have the retrograde, and we had this Mercury retrograde, the conjunction to the sun actually happened a few days before we got here. That's when we have the ahas of what's going on with the retrograde archetype, meaning through Aries, that's when we had those spontaneous realizations. Oh, this is what's important. This is what I need to take into consideration, Libra, and now I can let the rest of it go. Okay? Okay, if I move on with that? Okay. Venus. All right, Mercury's retrograde.
I have a retrograde question. How is Mercury, many people with Mercury retrograde have difficulty communicating, expressing. Can you talk about that?
Mercury retrograde, I don't even know who the person is, but somewhere along in the 80s or 90s it started, there was some female who wrote a book about communication between men and women. And it was kind of like, okay, somebody said something and then they had to repeat back what they said. This is what I think you said. Is this actually what you said? This is how you communicate with a Mercury retrograde person. All right? And Mercury retrograde person will then come back to you later on and say, no, that's not what I meant. This is what I said. And so you have to learn to be very, very flexible when you live with somebody who has a Mercury retrograde.
But based on their internal experience of themselves, there can be an immense amount of frustration because they think that they've communicated something. And when you go to them and you say, because I live with a Mercury retrograde person and I find myself doing exactly what you're doing, but I also notice their sense of internal frustration.
Yeah. What you want to do living with a Mercury retrograde person, when Mercury is retrograde, which, by the way, Mercury 88 days around the sun, so we have about 3, sometimes 4 Mercury retrograde cycles a year, and Mercury is retrograde 20 to 24 days when it goes retrograde. It's stationary period, stationary retrograde, stationary direct, 1 day. So when you live with a Mercury retrograde person, when Mercury is retrograde, you be quiet, let them talk. And it's when Mercury's retrograde, they'll be clear. Okay? One more and that's it. I'll take questions, but we're never going to get to Venus.
No, this is a pretty general question.
Yes.
About the house ruled by the planetary retrograde.
Yes. Take
How
all
does it
that
work?
in.
How does it work then?
Okay, I think I know what you're saying. Let's just say we have a Mercury retrograde like it is right now in Aries, okay? And if you correct me if I'm not hearing you correctly, okay? Mercury retrograde in Aries, and let's say that Aries is ruling the 3rd house, and Mars is the ruler of Aries, okay? So Mars is going to come in and impact that Mercury retrograde in Aries in the 3rd house. Yes, you will take that stuff into consideration. We could go through all the different examples, through all the 12 houses and the planetary rulers, but that's taking it a step further, which is what you do for those of you who are beyond being beginners. Am I hearing you correctly? Am I answering what you're asking? Okay. I could talk forever, but when I get going, but I have to, I'm limited to 75 minutes. So, okay, Venus, all right. Let me talk first, and then you can ask questions on Venus. Oh, Venus. I told you, you guys are really lucky I showed up for this conference. Venus retrograde natally. Wow, more of you than I expected. This is the rarest retrograde. Appreciate all you guys. Venus. Let me just first of all give you the little left brain stuff while I'm thinking about it. Venus has a cycle around the sun of 225 days. So it goes retrograde anywhere from 58 to 81 days when it goes retrograde. So it's about a month and a half. No, that's not what I was saying. It has a revolution around the sun of every 225 days. Venus around the sun every 225 days. At once every 542 days, Venus goes retrograde. That means approximately once every year and a half, Venus goes retrograde for anywhere from 58 to 81 days, approximately a month and a half. Got that? Follow that? Its stationary, retrograde stationary direct time period is 2 days. This is the rarest retrograde.
Can you explain that again? The 225-day cycle.
Sun, Venus around Sun, 225 days.
Yeah.
Because it travels so closely with Earth, it takes once every 542 days before it goes retrograde. Okay? And the Venus retrograde, here's a tidbit about the Venus retrograde, by the way. In 5 retrograde cycles, Venus makes a 5-pointed star. Okay? So if you will follow the Venus retrograde cycles, I think it works out to be every 8 years, you have Venus retrograde repeating itself in the same spot. So I have found my Venus retrograde cycles, Venus retrogrades run in 8-year cycles. So once every 8 years, you'll have it in that same sign, same house, close enough, just a few minutes off the degrees. I think it goes backwards through the zodiac. And you'll notice a repeating theme. Now, the next Venus retrograde is going to be the tail end of this year. And we have Venus, hold on, I'm going to get the little dates. We have Venus retrograde December 24th, 05 through February 4th, 06. Retrograde starts at 2 degrees Aquarius, and it goes back to 16 Capricorn. All right? So, the archetype of Venus. What we know Venus as in evolutionary astrology is the archetype of self-reliance. It works, it's known as the planet of love, giving and receiving love. But when any of us look at the whole issue of interacting with someone else and giving love and receiving love, if we are not self-reliant, what type of love does it turn out to be? Codependent. What's the opposite of Venus in the zodiac? Pluto. When you look at the natural houses rulerships. And so we get the possessiveness, the controlling, the Venus, the Taurus side of Venus is that frog in the well syndrome that EA talks about. The limitations. I have to have it just like this in order for me to feel safe and secure. Venus also has the rulership of Libra. Venus rules 2 signs as well, all right? And so the Libra side of Venus is that codependency that comes in. So again, I talk quickly just so that we get through everything, but we understand this Venus archetype of how well we can meet our own needs, self-reliance. And when we work with this, it means physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. It means on all 4 of the major levels. And so when we have someone who was born with Venus retrograde, it exaggerates all of these situations. We have someone who can have been overly codependent upon others in past lives, so they're thrown in upon themselves. And a Venus retrograde natally, and every time we have Venus retrograde by transit, collectively, we are all having to reevaluate what our essential needs are. What is it we need in order to be self-reliant, in order to take care of our own needs on every level? So the Venus retrograde person is doing this an entire lifetime. Venus retrograde people, Venus is an energy of attraction. You know, the Venus-Mars thing, Mars goes out and get it and Venus attracts it in. The Venus retrograde just emphasizes that inner magnetism of attracting it to them on a very strong level. And as Venus is having to really learn how to go in and establish its own needs, its own unique values separate from anybody else, it almost adds like a Uranian quality to it. A Venus retrograde person, when they are learning to evolve, they learn self-reliance on a very deep level. If we are looking at a very spiritually evolved person coming in with Venus retrograde, what is realizing ultimate self-reliance? The connection with Source. So that ultimate relationship to a Venus retrograde person becomes God, Goddess itself. So all Venus retrogrades are pointing that direction, all right? And it's just where are you at on that scale of learning to develop that inner relationship with yourself, which I consider the relationship we have with ourselves as identical to the relationship we have with God, Goddess. The degree to which we self-love is the degree to which we love Source. And it's the degree to which we allow Source to open up and love us. And so Venus retrograde is just opening up to emphasize all of that energy. Make sense for everybody with this? All right, questions? Yes, Joe?
Is it valid to look at where Venus retrogrades in your chart the same way you would look at where an eclipse is? And if so, would you also look at the 4 other points that would make up the star?
The 5-pointed star?
Yeah.
Gotcha. If you wanted to get into that much detail, you could, okay? Go back to the first part of the question. When you have Venus...
When Venus retrogrades, whether you have it natally or not, just looking at where it fits in a chart, would you give it the same emphasis you would as looking at where an eclipse is in a chart, or?
Yes, you can. Let me answer this way and see if this works for you, all right? When we go through Venus retrogrades by transit, it will fall in a particular house and sign of your chart. What will be most relevant is as you are figuring out those archetypes by house and sign, go backwards in time 8 years, 16 years, 24 years. That will give you more relevance. My own personal example for me, whenever I would have the Venus retrograde fall in my 8th house Pluto, natally, I would have a major transformation in a relationship. I would have one end, I would have one start. Okay, clear enough example? That help? Yes, Michelle?
Okay, say for example, a person has Venus retrograde in Aries and Mars in Taurus. Would you say in that example, just as a general, I know you have to be specific with all the criteria, but would you say that that's pointing more towards that internal Venus, Taurus side of Venus, the self-sufficiency?
Yes.
Just based on those symbols?
Yes, a Venus retrograde will point towards internal self-reliance regardless of what sign it's in.
The mutual reception as far as those 2 signs?
That would just emphasize it more.
Okay, that's what my question was. Thank you.
Yes?
Can you speak in general terms about if you have no retrograde planet like Venus, but it is progressed retrograde in across the board? Can you speak in general? What does
Then what that means, let's say you are not born with Venus retrograde, and in a lifetime Venus progresses to turn retrograde, it means you have reached a saturation point of taking in others' values and depending or wanting others to be responsible for you and your needs, or you being responsible for everybody else's needs. And that progressed Venus turning retrograde now means I must go within and reevaluate my essential needs at this point in my life. For the rest of my life, usually if Venus is retrograde by progression for the rest of the life, you will be doing that.
Can you apply that across the board as well to Mercury, Venus,
Yes.
Mars? Okay, progressed. Okay.
Yes. Yes, if a planet turns retrograde by progression, that planetary archetype then comes up for review for you for as long as that archetype is retrograde by progression. That in the back, Patricia?
So it goes stationary, it goes straight. You were born with it retrograde.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, so does that mean that you have solved that little problem?
Yes, you have that potential then that you've figured out that archetype, and now you get to really start moving forward with it again. The spiraling circle, evolution. Yes?
what is the meaning of the progressed planet coming back on its natal position after retrograding?
Good question. All right. We have a direct planet by birth. It goes retrograde by progression, and it retrogrades back over the natal planet. It's a aha point. Oh, I get it. And so it's like, okay, here's the example, okay? Here's the natal planet. It goes forward, okay? And then by progression, it starts retrograding. This is the throw off. I'm resisting, throw it off. I'm resisting, throw it off. I'm resisting. Oh, I get it. I'm supposed to throw it off. Okay, I'll really get rid of it. All right, here it goes. Oh, gosh, this is great. Okay? And then when it's slow, then you pick up all that you learn here, and you really start evolving and growing with it. And so you just start the spiral that just goes up. And it's like, wow, I get it. I really am self-reliant now in Venus's case. I really can say, no, you are not a healthy relationship for me. I'm going to do this myself till I find this person over here who is healthier. Again, I'm just trying to be quick. You get it? Okay. Venus, anything else that's burning with Venus? We'll go on. I got to check my time. Allow me to check my time. Half hour for 2 more, all right? Okay, Mars retrograde. First of all, let's get a little bit of the left brain stuff out of the way for me. The Mars revolution around the sun. Okay, again, Mars revolution around the sun, 1.88 years. We know it is 2 years, 1.88 years. It goes retrograde once every 2 years, all right? And it goes retrograde, hold on a second. Oh, Mercury retrograde, I just realized something. Back up to your notes. Love this. Venus retrograde is 40 to 43 days. It's the Mars retrograde that is 58 to 81 days. Got that? The Venus retrograde cycle is 40 to 43 days when it goes retrograde by transit. The Mars retrograde is 58 to 81 days when it goes retrograde by transit. All right? And the stationary point for Mars is 3 days. Stationary retrograde, 3 days. Stationary direct, 3 days. And we also have a Mars retrograde cycle the end of this year. Mars is retrograde October 1st through December 9th. And it's retrograde from 24 degrees Taurus to 8 degrees Taurus this year. As you start to follow the Venus and Mars retrograde cycles, because Venus is retrograde approximately every 19 months, and Mars is retrograde approximately every 2 years, we always have a Venus retrograde cycle either right before Mars retrograde or right after Mars retrograde. Venus takes turns going retrograde either before or after Mars as it cycles through every few years. Okay? All right? So Mars, just for review, Mars is the instinctive process of becoming. It's instinctively acting out. Mars is known as the conscious desires of Pluto, the soul, representing our mostly unconscious desires. So all those deep desires of the soul, Pluto, are made conscious via Mars. That's how we can actually know this is my desire, that's not my desire. So one of the things that we will say is that Mars is the leading edge of your desires. And now here's a nice point to recognize. Mars is the leading edge of your separating desires. Mars is the leading edge of your returning desires. Every soul has 2 main desires: a desire to separate from that which created it, a desire to return to that which created it. Those 2 conflicting desires to separate and return create each and every incarnation a soul has until the separating desires start to become exhausted and the returning desires start to become stronger and stronger and stronger. You become a Jesus, a Buddha, a Yogananda, and only the desire to return is left. All right? So Mars is how we exhaust those desires that emanate from deep within the soul. So now can you understand Mars and its rulership of Aries and that willpower, that just instinctual action that wants to go out there? How do you think Mars goes through a retrograde? Yeah. So, how many people, I got it this time, how many people have Mars retrograde? I'm married to one. I'm going to expose him. Okay, so we've got some Mars retrogrades in here. All right. So, what are some of the generic things that we can have happening with a Mars retrograde? The soul that comes in that way has overused their willpower in past lives, or they've misapplied that willpower in past lives. They've been so full of willpower and going out there and just chasing, Mars, that action without forethought. All right? So what happens with the Mars retrograde is they have got to come in and reapply or refocus how they're going to use their individual willpower. And so when you have a Mars retrograde soul, what will happen early on for them, early in childhood and early on in their life, they will sometimes have an appearance of no willpower or a confusion of willpower. They won't know quite what to do, all right? And so a Mars retrograde person will learn through initiating their willpower and reacting to it. Initiating their willpower and reacting to it. Similar to Mars direct, but even more intensified. And that potential is there for the Mars retrograde soul to learn how to have that forethought before they act. What will happen with that Mars retrograde is sometimes they put so much forethought into it that they paralyze themselves. They don't know which direction to go. So it takes a while in the lifetime of a Mars retrograde person for them to learn how to have an accurate application of their willpower. For them to get in touch with the desires that are coming up from the soul that really work for them in evolving in this particular lifetime. Make sense? Understanding this? Now, a Mars retrograde person, you cannot tell them what to do. Speak from experience. Actually, I was lucky we were a ways beyond before my husband and I got connected together, because I kind of got that one figured out. And so you have to allow a Mars retrograde person to zigzag and go all over the place. And just like that Mars and impulse to act will act and then it'll change its mind. That's still there with a Mars retrograde. And sometimes even more so. And you just got to open up and let it flow. And allow them to change their mind and apply it all they want. And again, when you look at a Mars retrograde person, you typically have someone who may or may not know what they want to do early on in life. Or they can go along in the experience for so long and then it's like, forget this stuff. Why was I doing this? And they go on to something else. They do it for a while, forget this stuff. Why am I doing this? I've seen several applications of this. But eventually what happens in the lifetime of somebody who has a natal Mars retrograde, they learn to have a more focused application of their will that really represents where their soul is trying to evolve. Mark?
Would that time occur during a Mars retrograde transit cycle or a powerful conjunction to that natal Mars retrograde? Would those things trigger that kind of potential?
Yes. When Mars is retrograde by transit to the Mars retrograde natal, it's like, oh, I get it. This is what I want to do. Exactly. Those significant aspects would then bring that in. So if you have Mars go retrograde by progression, then that is a pointer, an aha to you that there's been some over-application of your willpower trying to force it, and it's not going to work that way anymore. And so you've got to start doing some of that inner reflection. Any planetary retrograde says go within. Okay, remember, go within, whatever that archetype is. Go within to learn how to redirect that planetary archetype. There was somebody else who had their hand raised?
Well, I was thinking about the outer planets. I know you're not going to get into
Tomorrow.
them. Oh, okay. Tomorrow. Oh,
Thank you, honey.
Okay. I have Mercury retrograde, so I didn't hear that.
If we're lucky, we'll get through this class.
Can you speak toward intercepted planets? Is that sort of similar to retrograde?
Mars intercepted. Speak to planets that are intercepted, meaning that there's no signs on either side. There's a sign contained within. From the perspective of evolutionary astrology, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, and you really need to take everything in the chart into consideration, all right? Sometimes when you see intercepted signs, okay, if you look and see that archetype of that sign, okay, represented or emphasized elsewhere in the chart, that means that's been emphasized in past lives, and so it doesn't need to be in this lifetime. So it is slowing it down almost. It's kind of calming it down. If you don't see it emphasized, then it can be that that energy is needing to learn how to come out. It's kind of almost the opposite of what the traditional astrology would say. But again, you know, as with astrology, as with EA, it's not one size fits all. You really have to go in and, again, look at all the archetypes. Other questions on Mars? Yes?
Is this don't tell me what to do feeling a lifelong feeling, or like what Mark was talking about, when can there be an experience of maybe early in life of don't tell me what to do, and then they get focused at some point, and then maybe you can negotiate with them and you can talk with them? And
Yes, exactly. You know, let me answer that from a broad perspective just to help beginners with things. You know, a lot of the more traditional astrology, you know, those of us who are counseling astrologers, how often have you drawn in the client who says, I'm beyond my chart? I mean, I've actually drawn in the people who say, I don't work with my natal chart anymore. This is my rebirth. I want you to work with that chart. I say, you need a different astrologer. I actually tried it a couple of times, and I could, I finally tell them, if you let me work with your natal chart, put that one around the outer circle, see how it affects. I'm willing to do that, but otherwise go find someone else. So if you were born with natal Mars retrograde, okay, it will be retrograde throughout your whole life. But yes, exactly like you said, with time, you will learn a better reapplication of your will. And if that natal retrograde Mars then goes direct by progression, that will even bring that along more efficiently yet.
okay, but still, even if it's retrograde all your life, because my brother has that, and he was a wild child, and now he's very focused and organized and successful. And it's a completely different person.
Yeah, I'm married to one.
Okay.
Yeah. And probably there could have been some planetary, aspect, some indicator that represented when that shift happened for him. But that is the whole thing that should happen with a Mars retrograde at birth. If it's a soul that's really intending to try and figure things out, regardless of the evolutionary state, at some point they will learn how to reapply and focus their willpower in ways that are relevant for their soul in that particular lifetime. One more question?
What about a male chart and a female chart with a retrograde Mars or a retrograde Venus? Do you interpret that a lot different?
Okay, let me see if I'm hearing your question correctly. So what if we have a woman who has a retrograde Mars and a man who has a retrograde Venus? I come from the perspective of find a female chart that doesn't have a Mars, find a male chart that doesn't have a Venus. Doesn't matter what the gender is, everybody has a Venus and a Mars. So these generic applications that we are making, they will still apply. There can be some specifics that will come in through houses and signs that may emphasize some other indications of gender issues with a woman who has a Mars retrograde, okay, and man who has Venus retrograde, all right? But the generic stuff is not going to go away. A man who has a Venus retrograde still has to learn self-reliance, just like a female with a Venus retrograde. A woman who has a Mars retrograde still has to learn correct application of will, just as the male. One more question. I got to watch the time or we'll never get to Jupiter.
My retrograde Mars goes direct when I'm 50, so I won't be as wishy-washy.
We hope not. You get my point, though. You get what I'm trying to say with this. Is clear? Okay. Okay to go on to Jupiter and get one more in with this? Okay, Jupiter. Let's do the left brain stuff. Drink of water. Jupiter's revolution around the sun, we know it's 12 years. It's 11.86 years. All right? Jupiter, when we start with Jupiter, the planets on out, they all have retrograde cycles once a year. All right? Jupiter goes retrograde for approximately 120 days, so approximately 4 months we have a Jupiter retrograde cycle. Its stationary period, meaning stationary retrograde, stationary direct, is 5 days. When we start moving to Jupiter on out, those stationary periods start to become longer and longer. Now, Jupiter still belongs in what we would call the conscious planets. In other words, it's still something that we can know on an individual conscious level. So the stationary periods are just as emphasized as anything else. But one of the things that we will recognize tomorrow is as we start to work with more unconscious planets, those stationary periods will start to become even more emphasized. And again, you must look in the ephemeris and look in your actual birth chart to see if you have that happening. So here's something for those of you, when you don't have the planet retrograde, you can actually start to look at it in the chart. And if it's an inferior planet, Mercury or Venus, you want to see how far ahead of the sun it is, and if it looks like it's getting ready to go stationary retrograde, then you start looking in the ephemeris. And if it's one of the superior planets, Mars on out, you look to see how close it is to that opposition with the sun. And it'll be past opposition because through the retrograde, then it will retrograde back to oppose the sun. So again, just very generic clues to start looking to see if you have that stationary retrograde that's starting to take place in your chart. So Jupiter. The archetype of Jupiter is where we start to expand our consciousness beyond ourself. We know this Mercury, Venus, Mars that we've been talking with as being very personal planets. And so Jupiter is starting to grow and expand. It's what we know as intuition or the sixth sense. It's when you read your little happy books, it's the religions, it's the philosophies, it's the higher education. So what we're starting to do is we're starting to learn to work with what we would know as the right brain or the intuition or knowing something without knowing how we know it. All right, that's what we would call the intuition. So we're all can probably pretty much grasp this. So when we have Jupiter retrograde, all right, one of the things that happens with the archetype of Jupiter, Sag, 9th house, all right, when we're working with intuition and philosophy and this kind of stuff, with the Jupiter archetype, we will get into this thing we call psychological compensation. All right, we will, Jupiter, Sag, dealing with truth versus lies. And so the exaggeration that starts to come in there, so you can see how this starts to come along with this. So when we have somebody who is born with a Jupiter retrograde, it means that they have learned to be really good at compensating. They have taken in somebody else's philosophy, somebody else's beliefs and religions, somebody else's stuff so much that they don't know how to work with their own intuition anymore. They don't know how to work with their own inner knowing. And so that Jupiter retrograde, natally, forces them in, what are my beliefs? What are my values? Now, as we've heard talking about with some of the other speakers here this weekend, we've heard about what we would know as personal truth versus what we would know as universal truth or absolute truth, using words that you guys can just understand, okay? We are always in the process of evolving, so we are always in the process with the Jupiter archetype of being able to understand our ability to intuit what is truth. And we want to get to where we're at the timeless truth. And so Jupiter retrograde is really wanting to help us accelerate that. And so a Jupiter retrograde person is having to understand a truth that's personally relevant for them. And it may not be the whole truth, but it is getting them to the next step of what is their truth that allows them to have an inner relationship with themselves to a deeper level of trusting what they know that will then help them on that process of opening to a larger expansion of truth. This makes sense? Following this process with what I'm saying with this and how to do this? So when we have a Jupiter retrograde person, we can know from probably an archetypical level that this is someone who has somehow bought in again to somebody else's philosophy, somebody else's version. This is the Jupiter retrograde person thinks that person out there, their intuition is always better than mine. And so they've also bought into then some of the lies, including their own lies that they've bought into. And so when Jupiter's retrograde, there is this re-evaluation process of what is my truth, what are my lies, where am I playing games with myself, that I have to open up and recognize, this isn't me, this isn't who I really am, this is who I'm pretending to be, rather than getting in touch with what is my true essence. So it's exposing their own personal lies. And it can be exposing the collective lies that they've also bought into. Okay? Is this making sense? I'll bring out some more of the archetypes of Jupiter as they come into my left brain. But questions, let's start with that.
The Jupiter retrograde, how does that play out in a life? Does that involve some disillusionment at some point?
Yes, totally. Yes, another good point. Yes. Yes, a Jupiter retrograde person, especially when they're still trying to cling to those lies or what is not even a truth for them personally, they will have that disillusionment. Yes, and but they can also get Jupiter retrograde throwing back to Mercury. Okay, remember that ninth third house archetype, relativity of truth? They're going to get the confrontations from the other people who are just going to point their lies out to them and say, you're not going to get away with that. Very much. Yes?
Jupiter retrograde is in a skip step with the nodes. Yeah. Would the nodes be describing the lies and the compensations, the houses and signs of the no
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. That's an interesting question because I've been probably reading charts, I think, for maybe a dozen years now. And I have to tell you, the planet that I draw in, square the nodes the most often, some of you have heard me say this, is Jupiter square the nodes. And I draw it in a lot. And so here's a person, again, it's all relevant to evolutionary state conditioning and those signs and houses of the nodes that are square Jupiter. But yes, there will be skip steps on a generic level of lies versus truth. And the houses and the signs, the clues. And when you have Jupiter square the nodes, whatever node is clockwise from Jupiter, that's the resolution node. Yes, hon?
What about conjunction to the nodes? What about conjunction?
What about, okay, so let me rephrase this. Are you asking me about Jupiter retrograde conjunct the nodes?
Correct.
Okay, if we have Jupiter, pardon?
As opposed to square.
As opposed to the square. Okay, let's just take this very generically, all right? Jupiter conjunct the north node when Jupiter is retrograde at birth, all right? This is someone in which, again, you can see, I'm too trained to do the process thing. I want to do balsamic and new. And if it's balsamic, if the north node is balsamic Jupiter, there is an intense relived situation of having to face lies, false truths, false beliefs, not trusting their intuition. If it if the north node is new faith at Jupiter retrograde, it means that there can be some really good breakthroughs of moving forward. Jupiter retrograde conjunct the north node is always going to signify wanting to move forward. And again, the houses and the signs and the details of the phases are going to tell you the details. If it's Jupiter retrograde conjunct the south node, there is an intensity of a relived situation because that person, god darn it, it's the Billy Graham and I know I'm right, and they're just going to try and cling to whatever that is. It will intensify that retrograde, and it will intensify probably some of the confrontations and relives that they have to go through, and the real exposures of their lies. Like that. Other questions? Let's see where I'm at with time. We got about 5-7 minutes left. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. Yes, honey?
Can I go back to Mercury, retrograde Mercury? There is a guy, there is an astrologer by the name of Kopakar. He's from India, but he lives in the United States. He's an engineer, and he has written many books on retrogrades. What he says, it's true for me. It says you only feel it when retrograde Mercury connects with any of your planets. Like if it connects, makes it trine or conjunction, then you feel it. But if it's not, you don't feel it. And in my case, it's the truth.
Okay, so let me rephrase this for everyone and see if I'm hearing you correctly. All right? Mercury retrograde.
Yes.
Someone else is saying that you can feel the impact of Mercury retrograde if it's making aspects to other planets.
To any of my planets.
To any of your planets. And so that it's relative through that planet that you feel the Mercury retrograde?
Yes.
That is true. But it's also true, you can have Mercury retrograde unaspected and you're still going to know a Mercury retrograde. You're still going to feel the impact of Mercury retrograde. Those of you in the room who have Mercury retrograde, if you know whether or not you have any unaspected planets, if you have Mercury retrograde that's all by itself, you will still feel it. Bless you. Lucky you. Yes, hon?
Can you describe, Kim, from your observations, what you see in a retrograde individual, people that have more than, you were saying, 4 retrograde planets, what your observations have been in general with those individuals?
Okay, if we have what we would term maybe a retrograde personality, meaning we're starting to get into 4, 5, 6 planets retrograde, that's what we're going to work with tomorrow. That's tomorrow's example. My chart example tomorrow, we're going to spend all tomorrow on one chart. This person has 5 planets retrograde, the 4 outer planets plus Mars. So, let's just say there's so many different applications, but in essence, this is a soul that has had an intensity of resistance to evolution. And now that there's no choice but to come back in. And a lot of the relive or re-experiencing or withdrawing or whatever the case may be with the planets, houses, signs, it's all about getting the soul to evolve, to grow. Michelle?
I was just going to say that I had a client that had every single planet retrograde, second house Pluto, and she manifested in her life 3 car accidents within a 5-year period. So that would be a good example of being stuck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, 5 minutes. Questions? Yes, honey.
When you spoke about Mars retrograde, it just was reminding me so much of Mars Pisces in certain ways that I would like you to differentiate that. Even
Good
though,
point.
Yeah.
Good point. Mars retrograde will have repressed anger. So a Mars retrograde can seem like a Mars in Pisces or a Mars in the 12th house or a Mars strongly aspected to Neptune, because there will be repressed anger. Because, again, Mars is that instinct to act, that instinctual going out there. And when it's retrograde, it's blocked. And it gets frustrated and angry. And so Mars retrograde has to go within and figure out that source of anger so that it can then learn how, again, to have a correct application of the instinct to act. Yes, Sunny.
Would the source of the anger be relative to where the progressed Mars is retrograde?
Yes. Yes, and the source of the anger could probably almost be projection. Remember, outer reflects from the inner. And, when we have a lot of that Pisces stuff, there can be a lot of projection. And so that Mars retrograde, okay, there can be a lot of this, they don't want to reflect. They just want to keep on acting. And Mars retrograde says, you are going to reflect this lifetime. Okay, you're telling me 5 minutes, or you're asking a question?
Show of hands, how many people have Jupiter retrograde?
Oh, Jupiter retrograde, we forgot. Jupiter retrograde. Oh, see? When we start getting into the outer planets, okay, they're retrograde once a year, and they're retrograde for long periods of time. Jupiter is retrograde a third of the year. So we're going to start to see that. See how that represents that process of evolution? Just as those outer planets. Yes, Stacy?
If a natal planet is direct, but the north node of the planet is retrograde, do we interpret that like a progressed retrograde?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, honey, I'm going to rephrase that, and I'm going to try to help it out with some of the beginners who are in. You're talking about planetary nodes other than the moon. You're talking about Mars, or a natal planet, meaning any of the planets, okay? All planets have north nodes, south nodes, all right? You've heard us talking about this a little bit. SolarFire is the software program that will give you all the planetary nodes for those of you who are interested in that. And so we have the natal planet, but that's direct, and we have the north node, but that's retrograde with that. You know, the planet direct, there is that energy to go forward without as much obstruction as it is when it's retrograde. But when that north node is retrograde, there will be a little bit of wanting it to reflect. Okay, there's a little bit of saying, okay, are we really sure we want to go in this direction? Close enough? That help? Understand? Okay. Yes, honey.
Our last Venus retrograde was in Gemini, and it included its eclipse of the sun. Any thoughts on the influence of that for the collective?
Do you remember when that was?
Last June.
Last June.
Well,
Was Lucifer in Gemini then?
I don't know. I don't watch Lucifer.
Yes, that's, yeah, big impact. Big impact. I mean, you know, what it would be generically, Venus, values, you know, self-reliance, Gemini. When any planet's in Gemini, you notice that, you know, that nervous tension that will sometimes come along, and the energy here and there and here and there. Venus retrograde always asks us to go within. Venus retrograde in Gemini, what's coming back for me when I was working with this and writing my forecast, it's that people have to learn how to have such a deep inner self-reliance that they can literally go with the flow with all of the chaotic changes that are happening in the world. So those who were really defining security by outside of themselves would feel the impact of that a lot stronger than people who were really trying to learn to go within with their self-reliance, which is what Venus retrograde would point to anyway. And again, so that Venus retrograde in Gemini pointing to that deep inner self-reliance that says, I can be okay in this circumstance, that circumstance, any circumstances. This world's in chaos around me, but I'm going to learn how to take care of myself, and I trust and know that I will just connect in source with what I need to take care of myself in any moment. All right, am I out of time? Okay, a couple more questions.
Any thoughts on Lucifer retrograde?
Oh dear. Lucifer, you asked me that with 3 minutes left. There's a beautiful, for the registered students, I do monthly phone classes, and sometimes I have some of the other EA grads come in and help, and we do some co-teaching. And so there's a beautiful Lucifer tape on the back table that had Adina and Rose Marcus and myself talking about Lucifer. For beginners, if I may answer this way for you, evolutionary astrology has been probably the astrology that has been working with the asteroid we know as Lucifer. Website, if you go to Adina's website, which is Blue Lotus Astrology, she'll probably have the ephemeris for Lucifer listed. If you got on the tape of that class, there will be an ephemeris. Lucifer is known as asteroid number 1930, has a 4.5-year cycle around the sun. And what we know Lucifer is representing is in what we would know in EA as the separating forces or evil. All right, and so you can come back and ask me your question again, but I wanted to get this in for beginners. Am I answering your question? Tell me the question again.
My question was any thoughts on Lucifer retrograde?
Oh, Lucifer retrograde. Gotcha, thank you. Lucifer retrograde, if you look at Lucifer being the archetype of what represents the separating forces and separating desires, when Lucifer is retrograde, there is the potential to then point back to source. All right? And now this would be for souls who are intending their desire to know source again. Now that's not how it is applied in the collective consensus states. But for those of you in this room, it's applicable. One more question in this, and I'm sorry, you guys, but one more. Speak up, honey.
If you have a planet retrograde and you're speaking about the polarity point, what does it mean if the planet at the polarity point is retrograde as well?
They go back and forth with each other. They're giving each other information all the time. Boom, 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 boom. Both retrograde planets opposing each other. They're exposing everything about each other that needs to be reviewed, reevaluated, evolved. And again, you take a particular or relative to whatever the two planets are by their house sign. Okay? You guys have been wonderful.